All right. Welcome everybody to another episode of Seat Automotive Podcast. Your buddy CJ here, talking to you about all things automotive, the gearhead hobby, cars, all the things we love to talk about. Guys, we got a special episode tonight. I was thinking about you all day. I was traveling. Your buddy CJ was traveling home, had an incredible Christmas holiday trip with family, friends, loved ones. It was fantastic. It was a long day though. Guys, I got up early, went to the airport, and delays. So if your buddy CJ seems a little tired tonight, it's because I am. But that's not slowing me down. Got to have an extra gear. Not everybody has that extra gear. We keep going. Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. We keep going. And tonight, special topic, fun topic. Top 5 most important cars of the 1980s. Top 5 most important cars of the 1980s in terms of our hobby, the automotive hobby, what was important to gearheads back in the day and through the decades. Those cars that have proven through the decades that they were important and significant to our hobby, but that also made an impact back in the day. That's my criteria. You may have different criteria. This is my list. I want to hear from you. Leave your comments if you disagree. I promise I'll respond to all the comments I hand or that you leave, or come on the show. Come on the show. Let's talk about it. But guys, let's get into this. Top 5 most important cars of the 80s, according to your buddy CJ. First things first, we are going to take a look at this beauty. Guys, I'm here to tell you that you can't talk about the 1980s decade for the automotive hobby without talking about the Ford Mustang GT. 5.0 liter. Rolling in my 5.0. Are you kidding me? This was a performance icon back then. When this car came out looking that way, with that styling, that sporty, fun, that red laser. Look at that red laser trim going around the body. Are you kidding me? Nothing says 80s like that car. And if you think about Mustangs from the 60s and 70s, this couldn't have been more of a different vibe. This was a different vibe. Look at those headlights. But what it did, and why I think it's a super important car, in addition to just being great, incredible performance cars, and a whole heck of a lot of fun, it carried on that Mustang nameplate from the 60s, 70s into a whole new decade and a whole new generation of car guys. The girls were into these cars too. The girls were into the guys who drove these cars. The girls drove these cars. Vanilla Ice drove one of these cars. These cars were in films and movies. And these were attainable cars. The 5.0 liter, that 302, that rock solid engine, okay, that responded well to bolt-ons. Bolt-on culture. Bolt-on culture was alive and well in the 80s. And this car, the Ford Mustang GT, was a big part of that. Who got one of these and left it bone stock? Some guys did. Got to have the manual, versus the automatic maybe, right? There was the LX thing as well. Whole other vibe with the Mustang LXs. But who put wheels on it? Who put the lowering springs on it? Exhaust, cam, heads, intake, whatever. Gears, rear end. Okay, this car proved that the automotive hobby, the car guy hobby, was alive and well in the 1980s. Kept it going. And it also captured the attention of that generation. This wasn't your father's Mustang. It carried on the blue oval tradition, carried on that V8, didn't it? But this was not your father's Mustang. Look at that styling. Beautiful car. We didn't call them Fox bodies back in the day. Leave me comments if you want, if you did. I didn't hear anybody call anything a Fox body. We talked about these at the bus stops. Your brother had one. Your schoolmate had one. Whatever. You had one. We talked about these cars at the lunch table in school. On the weekends, we talked about Mustangs. Okay? We went to the dealerships and looked at Mustangs. All right? This car really was a huge part of the automotive culture, of the scene, if you will. The hangout scene, the cruising scene in the 80s. This was it. But wait a minute. wait a minute. If we're going to talk about the Ford Mustang GT 5.0 of the 80s, we got to talk about the Nemesis. Guys, how about the Nemesis? And here she is. Look at that. Enter the Nemesis. Chevy Camaro. This happens to be an IROC Z. Okay. There was a Camaro for everybody in the 80s, by the way. What were they? The Iron Dukes, the 4-cylinders, the V6s, small block Chevy, the 305s, carbureted engine, tuned port injection, TPI, 5.7 liter, the 350. There was a Camaro for everybody in the 80s. This was probably top dog for the most part, IROC Z. Look at that thing. I said it before in another episode. Even if you're a Ford guy, you got to admit, Chevy guys out there, let's tell them like it is. This thing looks like it rolled off the IROC series racetrack, right off the racetrack into your garage. Look at those lines. Look at the styling. Look at the hood. The grille with the blackout, the headlights, the fog lights. They sat low, available in T-tops. Had that hatchback, all that glass back there. This car, available later in convertibles as well. The last version of the third-gen Camaro. This is a third-gen Camaro. Those of us who are into Camaros would call it. But guys, this is the Nemesis to the Mustang. And I couldn't put the Mustang on this list. And I put Mustang as number one for a reason. I tend to be more of a Camaro guy. I've owned both. I've owned Camaros. I've owned Mustangs. Back in the day, I'll be real, I was more of a Camaro guy. Okay? But I put the Mustang first for a reason. I think that's a really important car from the 80s. Let me know what you think. But you can't talk about that car without talking about the Nemesis. And make no mistake, the Camaro was the natural enemy, the sworn enemy in the jungle. Pepsi versus Coke. Give me a break. It wasn't Ford versus Ferrari back in the day. Sorry. It's not. If you grew up living and breathing this hobby as a kid during that era, it was Mustang versus Camaro. Be real. Not unlike the way it was in the 60s and 70s. That's not my era. That predates me. But in all seriousness, big rivalry. Everything I said about the Mustang, you could say about the Camaro. Bolt-ons, mods, lowering, the big wheels, the American Racings or the Kragers. You put them on there. Look cool. Make it your own. The window tint, the stereo systems, the exhaust, whatever it might be. Bolt-on culture, was alive and living well in the 80s. And this car was a big part of it. Camaro versus Mustang. Such an incredible time. And again, to be a young guy, and I said this before in another episode as well, you couldn't be a fan of both. You had to pick one. Yankees versus Mets. Texans versus Cowboys. I don't know. Use any sports analogy you want. You got to pick one. You were Camaro or you were Mustang. Maybe you were Mopar. Maybe you were something else. We'll talk about some of those other things in a minute. But bottom line, this was Civil War in the 80s for car guys. Camaro versus Mustang. So this is number 2 on my list. Now you ready for this? The two heroes, maybe. We got Mustang and Camaro, depending on where you sit, the two heroes of the era. But isn't it interesting when the anti-hero enters? How about the man in black? Who's ready for this? When this car entered, this car was so disruptive, so wrong, yet so right in the 80s. I'm talking about the Buick Grand National. Nothing that looked that sinister and mean existed. Based on a platform from a brand like Buick, Buick was your grandfather's brand or dad's brand in the 80s. They weren't making anything like this. Are you kidding me? And on top of all that, the coolest styling on the road. That's a factory. I'm looking at that. That's basically bone stock. What you're looking at in that picture. Going down the road in the 80s, nothing looked meaner. Nothing. And not everybody could afford one of these. Let me be blunt. A lot of Mustangs and Camaros on the road and Corvettes. You didn't see many of these. I don't have the production numbers in front of me. Leave comments if you happen to know them. But you didn't see a lot of these. And when you did, if you were a car guy, you took notice because you knew what it was. A lot of people didn't know what these were. Look at that grill. Look at the bulge in the hood. Let's talk about what's under the hood. Is there a V8 under that hood rumbling on down the road? No. Turbocharged V6. What a premonition of things to come later on in the automotive industry and in our hobby, where some of the highest performance vehicles on the road are turbo, smaller displacement, 4-cylinder, V6, twin turbo, whatever, putting out big numbers, burning a hole in the earth. This car was doing it in the 80s. How about the rivalry and all of the controversy with this car being right up there with the Corvette? This car smoking Ferraris. All kinds of articles, Car and Driver Magazine, Motor Trend, Motor Week on television when that came out. They all talked about it. This car and its variant, what is it, the GNX, are you kidding me? Even the regular Grand National, just ridiculous performance. For a V6 turbo in that body, look at the size of that thing. This is a Regal body. They made a T-type Regal. A lot of the state troopers in the state of Connecticut, for example, had the T-type Regals. They were gray or they were maroon. Leave me comments if you remember that, or if your jurisdiction or state also had T-type Regals used in law enforcement. They also used, I saw in Florida, by the way, going back to the Mustang, Florida state troopers had, I lived down there for a while, Florida had a bunch of 5-liter Mustang LXs. I also know of some third gens that were used in law enforcement, but not many. Again, it's just a bit of a side note. But coming back to this car was available in trims like for your grandfather, for cruising, just cruising with the grandkids or the family, or as a daily. Not so for this car. This was the performance variant, and what a beast it was. I call it the anti-hero. I call it the man in black because it just shouldn't be. Yet it was. And how unusual and unprecedented. I know Buick did some performance things in earlier decades, but in the 80s, they weren't doing anything like this, and they haven't done anything like this since. Unfortunately, bring back the Grand National. Buick did a few things with front-wheel drive cars, higher performance variants of the Regal in front-wheel drive, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't this thing. This thing is a performance and muscle icon, highly collectible. And not, again, I'm not talking about decades later when the car was rediscovered after Fast and the Furious or after collectors got hot on it. I'm talking about back in the day. These cars were highly drooled over by car guys, and they were slightly or significantly out of reach for your average, dare I say, blue-collar hobbyist like myself coming up as a kid in that era. Okay, guys, I'm probably going to generate a little controversy right now, or maybe not. I told you that this was kind of my perspective on some of the most important cars to our hobby coming out of the 80s era. And I'm going to show you this car, and let's talk about it. Might kind of surprise you coming from me, but are you kidding me? BMW 325i convertible. This car had its own vibe in the 80s. This was the genesis, in my opinion, of BMW as a performance brand and BMW's massive and significant omnipresence as a performance and premium brand in the automotive enthusiast hobby. Before this car, there were BMWs, there were hot BMWs, there were special BMWs. M had a presence in the 80s. I don't have production numbers in front of me. I know a lot of those cars are collectibles. But this car specifically, mass-produced, and you saw these all over the place. If you were a car guy in the 80s, this was a whole different vibe. I always say, like, this was for the young, up-and-coming professional who maybe had his first job out of college, had a few bucks, maybe he'd buy that to be cool, to cruise in it. Probably wasn't a car guy, candidly. It was probably not your traditional muscle car buff or performance gearhead type. This was someone who was going for a bit of a pose and an image. I'll be real with you. A lot of the girls like these cars. The girls like the guys who had these cars. You might consider this like a country club kid cruiser. None of my friends had these. None of the guys I hung out with could afford these. But a lot of young cats did. Maybe they came from a family with significant means, and they did have one in high school. Wow, they drive a Beamer. That's when the concept, the lingo of the Beamer came out. If you had a Beamer, the status symbol, the rise of the yuppie. Oh, a little bit of fun there. But in all seriousness, that's a big part of this. This car was a pose. They had a whole ad campaign, the ultimate tanning machine, with the convertible, kids with the Ray-Bans, or the young guy with the Ray-Bans, cruising around in their BMW. These cars were not performance monsters. This is not an M car, but this car was really a predictor of things to come around the desirability of the BMW brand. And I think it planted a lot of seeds. They're collectible today. Okay, whenever I see one on the road, and I don't see many survivors, these cars were everywhere. But it was its own thing, and there was almost a rivalry, right? If you were a Camaro guy or you were a truck guy, trucks were big in that era in the 80s, and in the dudes cruising around the BMWs, those are like the rich kids. It was just a whole other vibe. So there was a rivalry. Like they were the Euro performance car gang. And I say they were rich kids. They weren't all rich kids, but you know what I'm saying? That image, that Euro performance car gang versus the muscle car gang. It was just a different vibe. There was a healthy rivalry. And it all started there. And it continues through the decades. And now if you think about the hobby in BMW and the significance of the BMW brand in motorsports, in the automotive enthusiast hobby, guys steady getting big power out of these cars with a tune, with a downpipe, with other aftermarket accessories, bolt-ons. These cars putting out big numbers. Turbos, you name it. Monster cars. Even right out of the box, the M cars, incredible. They're beasts. But this car, in my mind, kind of started it all. This is when BMW really hit my radar as a young man in the 80s, as a car enthusiast, an up-and-comer in the 80s. So I claim super important car for what it stood for the development of the brand, and how it evolved from here. It all started with the 325i in my mind. Guys, I got to get to number 5. Number 5 on my list. This car was, you talk about icons. This car was an ideal. This car was an aspiration. I'm talking about the Lamborghini Countach. Was it Countach or Countach? Leave your comments. Honestly, we didn't know back in the day. Look at the production numbers for this car, the Lamborghini Countach, compared to Ferrari, compared to Porsche, compared to anything you want. In the entire lifespan of the Lamborghini Countach, they only built, I believe, less than 2,000 of these. Now, why is that relevant? I'll tell you why it's relevant. I never saw these in the 80s. Most people didn't. If you lived maybe in Hollywood or wherever, or some rich guy collection, someplace, you might have seen one. But for the most part, this was an extreme rarity on the roads, but it existed. It existed pervasively in our hobby. Where? In posters? Raise your hand, shout out. Leave me comments if you had a poster of the Lamborghini Countach in your bedroom. Leave me comments if you bought Road and Track, Car and Driver, and got out the scissors and cut out the photo of the Lamborghini Countach and stuck it up in your locker. I did. And I say it was a dream. It was an ideal. Yes, Ferraris were right up there. Yes, the Porsches. We didn't see many of the Gustau Porsches back in the day. All of that stuff caught our eye. But this car, in my view, really in that era for our hobby, when you thought of the top of the heap, cutting edge, the aspirational idea of just ultimate performance car, for the most part, this was the ideal. This car was Superman. And it only existed, this car was the unicorn. It only existed in our dreams on Motor Week, in the car magazines. But we thought about it, we talked about it, but it wasn't a car. See, here's the thing, right? The Ford Mustang GT was important, perhaps more important in many ways, but you could see those. Your brother had one. Maybe you were getting one. You got one. Your dad had one. Your uncle had one. Your buddy had a Camaro. Your uncle, some guy down the street had a Grand National. You could see these in the parking lots. You could see them at cruise night on Friday night, driving around. You could see them in high school parking lots every day. And it was a huge part of our tangible automotive hobby and culture on the streets every day. Not so much for the Lamborghini Countach, but why was it so important? Because it was an icon, it was an ideal, it was something we dreamed about, we salivated over, we talked about. The only thing we knew of this car was what we read about. And it was like reading about some legend right out of the pages of Car and Driver and Road and Track into your mind and out of your mouth at the lunch table, hanging out with your buddies, talking about cars. What's your dream car? I want the Lamborghini. What's your dream car? I want the Ferrari, or I want this. Or the Lamborghini always came up, inevitably. Of course, there were those guys who were more into stuff out of the 60s. Of course. I'm not saying there weren't. But in the era of the 80s, how special was this car for many of us? And fast forward to now where you can see Ferraris, McLarens, Lamborghinis, fill in the blank, supercars on the road, produced, large, much higher production runs and production numbers. Not so in that time. Ferrari had some pretty big numbers back in the day. If you actually look at it during this era, not so for Lamborghini. Lamborghini had some tough financial times and wouldn't exist if some moves weren't made around the organization, kind of like Porsche and others. The financial viability of certain car makes coming out of that era was suspect at best during that era. Listen, the importance of this car as an icon, there was, you talk about cross branding, Alpine stereos, because if you were a car guy, you were probably also into car stereos in the 80s. Many of us were. So Alpine was a big brand for head units, for amplifiers, all that stuff. They had an ad in the magazines. I can still see it in my mind. I should have pulled it up for the show here. But Alpine had an ad with the outline, silhouette of the Lamborghini Countach. Who remembers that? So this was the car. This was the aspirational, when you thought about super performance, ultimate dream car, it was the Lamborghini Countach. It was for me, as well as some other cars. But it was so far out of reach, right? And it was just such an ideal. And it was so important in the posters. And again, it's not to say that the Ferraris weren't there and other stuff, but this car was just a big part of the hobby, and a big part. And I think it was an important brand, an important image, and just an important moment in the history of our hobby. So, guys, I'm going to leave it at that. I want to hear give me your top 5. Leave your comments. Let's hear what your top 5 most important cars of the 80s are. Love you guys. Thanks for checking out the show. It's your buddy CJ, wrapping up the Christmas holiday season. A bit tired, but also super excited and wanted to get out here and talk to you guys a bit tonight because it's so much fun doing what we do. Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. Looking forward to hearing from you. Love you guys. Speak to you on the next one. Peace.